I teach a class sometimes on programming the Atari, the 1977 Atari video game system. And in my syllabus, it's like, ChatGPT just doesn't have it just doesn't know how to write code for this thing. So it's not going to work. I don't have to police you. It's just not going to be helpful. Um, and that
Yeah.
question isn't really a question about AI. It's a question about like, what should we be doing in the classroom or in the design of the educational program more broadly that deeply connects the learning experience to the outcomes, to the student experience, to the faculty, what faculty have to contribute as teacher researchers. And it's well past time to do that.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president of the New York Academy of Sciences. And today, I'm delighted to welcome Ian Bogost for a conversation about the role in society of video games, the cultural and psychological aspects of AI, and different approaches to teaching, technology, but indeed to education in the broadest of senses. Ian is a philosopher, an author, a game designer, and a professor whose work explores the intersection of technology, media, and culture. He is currently the Barbara and David Thomas Distinguished Professor at Washington University in St. Louis. He is also the co-executive director of the Office of Public Scholarship and a Provost Fellow in Interdisciplinary Initiatives. He was previously the Director of Film and Media Studies at Georgia Tech. And he's published widely on video games, object-oriented philosophy, artificial intelligence, and the cultural meaning of everyday life. Ian, great to have you with us today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Ian, reading the introduction raises, of course, immediately the question of...
It does.
What do you do?
What do I do?
You do a lot of different things. And you have, of course, written about a lot of different things, but you've also done a number of things. And among other things, you have done a lot of work in the world of digital technology, and you've done gaming, and you've written about gaming, but you also studied philosophy and comparative literature. So could you give us a kind of introduction to how these different elements that normally are affiliated with different individuals for a podcast of this kind all got assembled in the package that is Ian
It's
Bogost?
a fair question. People ask me this question every time they meet me, and it's a question that I wish I had a better answer to, but I've been developing better and better answers every time I'm asked.
So maybe you'll figure this out eventually.
Maybe this is the
We
time.
ask you
Maybe this
often
is
enough.
the time.
Yeah.
What I would say about my interests and background is that, first of all, they don't quite all work together, even now, today, even at a time when it feels like they should. All the things that you mentioned are of a piece with one another now in the, we're a quarter of the way into the 21st century. And yet it's still difficult. We still have to ask the question, what does it mean to be a philosopher and a computationalist and be interested in history and culture and game design and those kinds of things? And I think I was just very early in recognizing that complexity or that challenge or that difficulty. But there's a few moments in my history that I think are relevant to answering the question. One is that I grew up in the early 1980s at the same time that the microcomputer, the personal computer, was new and was very basic. You couldn't do anything with it really, or anything that it could do, an ordinary person could make it do. You'd boot up your Apple II or whatever you had, and you'd get a prompt, and you could start writing basic programs or assembly programs in it. And people did that. And the Apple in particular was advertised to the general public as being able to do that. You had people at their tables of their kitchens writing software to balance their books or what have you. So growing up with the microcomputer, that was important to me as a way of becoming interested in computing.
And you began very early.
I began very
early to figure out how to write some code.
I was lucky, really. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I went to private school with a bunch of Sandia National Labs kids, kids of engineers at the National Labs, and we had computer labs, in like 1980 or whatever it was. So we had TI-99 computers, and we were formally taught program them even that early. It wasn't the earliest. You know, we've Seymour Papert and others who developed a logo, which is one of the things that I learned based on Lisp and Scheme back in the 60s and 70s, and the idea of using computers as a way of learning how to make things with media was popularized already in the 70s, Alan Kay and others. But that was still very hypothetical, and it was just completely normal to me. Completely normal to me in the early 80s, being exposed to that and doing it.
So interesting. You know, I mean, I don't want to disrupt this narrative, but I recall very clearly in the 1980s, I'm a little older than you, but I'm a historian, so I was going to the archive and I was going to Britain for a year. And I realized I could take notes, not with a typewriter, but with a computer, which meant that So I got one of the earliest portable computers I could find, a Zenith,
Portable.
which portable. It was very heavy, but you could carry it. And I took it to the archive, and I got them to keep it during the week, so I only had to carry it with me. But you know, I thought I was a computer guy because I'd been using them from the beginning, you know, starting at Caltech when I was there, and they had a Unix system plugged into the wall in every office in the humanities area. But I never wrote code, so I'm always interested in how the people who saw a computer and wanted to open it up and find out how it actually worked, or at least figuratively do that by themselves.
I mean, I'm already going to throw us off of script here, but the question that this brings up for me is one of like, what should you be taught and what should you learn? And I have an argument with many of my colleagues in computer science education about this, because over the last 25 years in particular, we've become interested in getting as many people of as broad a background as possible into computer science for very good reasons, for better representation in the profession. And so the education has kind of moved higher and higher level. And to me, learning the fundamentals of anything is important first. And so being able to learn those fundamentals, as I was just describing, because they were just the only thing that you can do, what accidental good luck I had to be able to learn the basics of computing when computers were so basic. And I feel that that happened to me so early in life at the same time that I was learning all the other basics, when I was learning about writing and reading and art and culture and all the other things that interested me. And the reason I started with the computing example is because to me that was just another thing, and another normal thing that had kind of predated me and been around, even though I didn't know at the time that computing was relatively new, especially for ordinary people. I mean, you know, we had mini computers and mainframes, and you can trace it back, you know, maybe a century or so, depending on how you think about it.
Not in everybody's home.
Yeah. So to me, as a kid, all of those things were fair game. And why wouldn't someone, and me in particular, be interested in all of them, be interested in art and culture and literature and philosophy and computing as well? And why wouldn't they work together in the same way that, let's say, that a philosopher uses words and publishes ideas in codex form, which is another kind of technology.
You were already interested in philosophy and already interested in
I mean, not when I was 5 or whatever, but I was interested in ideas. I knew that I was interested in.
So that mix
ideas.
Was already part of the.
Yeah, it was, and I had the opportunity to be encouraged to be interested in all those things at home and at school. You know, in the fine arts, I was exposed to philosophy as a specific subject in school in a way that others weren't, maybe in the same way that I was fortunate to be exposed to computing. And so by the time I got to college in the early 90s, it occurred to me that I should be able to do both. But still at that time, it was hard. It wasn't really possible to do both. And so the decision I made at the time was to pursue a professional life in computing. The internet was brand new. We were just moving from CD-ROMs to the web, and no one knew how to do any of it. It was all, everybody was just messing around trying to figure out the internet. It didn't matter who you were as long as you knew something. And because I had this background, I was able to learn something very quickly, and I worked professionally in what became the dot-com world, by the mid-90s. And there I was in undergrad thinking, well, I'm never going to get a chance to be a philosopher. This is a completely inviable future for me.
So that was the fun part.
That was the fun part. Yeah, that's why I did it, because I knew that
you worked nights.
Yeah, or day. I mean, when you're in school, you have more time than you
Right.
think you do. I worked part-time, and then And I remember thinking very, very in the very front of my mind that this was a deliberate choice I was making, that I couldn't put them together formally, that universities and the world didn't yet make that possible. Maybe they once would. The best bet for me was to study literature and philosophy and the like while I had the chance, because I never would again. I'd never become a philosopher, which I did. And then I would always have a career in computing if I wanted it, which I also did. I wish that I had been more present of mind to realize that I was making a risk management decision, which later became very important to me in the way that I conceptualized my life and the lives of other university professors that I managed or tried to manage
In
in
the
my
sense that
career.
you always had a backup.
That's correct. And so because I had a backup, I was able to take intellectual risks as a philosopher that I wouldn't have had the guts to take otherwise, because it didn't matter. Like I could always go work in the tech industry. That really it completely colored the way that I thought about my career, and I
It's
think about
hugely
it often.
freeing. I
It
mean,
was, yeah,
I mean, I feel like I had that partly because I didn't expect to get an academic job either. I didn't have a backup plan yet, but I figured I could always find one. But today, students are clearly always being told to focus on, not only their subject, but on a subject that is going to have a very clear career outcome. And, I felt that it was very limiting. And of course, I think we'll get to current kinds of educational theories about this in time, but you clearly had a kind of freedom that is enviable.
yeah. And to me, what I wanted, I mean, this is maybe a little bit of sort of retroactive justification to me. But what I think I wanted out of my life and out of the lives of those that I surrounded myself with in the computing industry, the tech industry at the time, were just kind of fully formed people who had lots of interests, who knew about lots of things. And the thing about the dot-com era, that period of the mid to late 90s,
Hmm.
before everything went haywire, the folks who worked in that sector, they weren't like the tech industry, whatever your preconception or stereotype of the kind of tech bro is today. No one came up into that. We were the underdogs at the time.
But you were in LA.
I was in LA.
You weren't in the Silicon
No, that's
Valley.
right.
Might it have been different if you were in Palo Alto or at Stanford?
I'm sure it would have been different at Stanford. And I'm sure it would have been different but Silicon Valley wasn't the same then as it was now either. We were still trying to solve problems, though, for the world through computers and the internet, and we had to convince the powers that be, which we weren't yet in the tech industry, that those problems were worth solving through internet connected computing. And there was a lot of deference, necessary deference. And I think that the people I work with, the people I remember working with who came into that world, they weren't maybe exactly like me, but they were like me in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
It wasn't common to have done a computer science degree and then to
Yeah, no,
enter.
those were not the days
No,
when just every student wanted to major in computer
no.
science. They were still fighting to have their separate identity from electrical engineering at
I
that
would
point.
say the minority of folks I remember working with professionally, like in these big companies, what became big companies in the dot-com era, but they were not computer science educated. Now, the ones that were computer scientists went on to have very successful careers getting into it at that moment.
Right.
But it wasn't necessary. And it wasn't even really discussed as like, you need to know how to make the computer work, but no one knew how to make the computer work in this way.
Hmm.
And that really served me. I have, though, whole course of my career, been accused of being like a bricoleur, that, oh, you've got all these interests, they don't make sense together. You're just kind of a jack of all trades. And maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. And I've nevertheless managed to make it work. But having all those interests, we used to call that. I mean, not to toot my own horn or anything, but we used to call that a kind of holistic, Renaissance man
Yeah,
kind
no,
of
but I mean,
aspiration, right?
one person's Renaissance man is somebody else's dilettante, right? So let me ask you about though, what you were doing in particular in the dot-com world, because at some point you began to do a lot of work in the gaming space, and clearly many people who worked in that area not only did very well, but they did things that weren't specifically about games. Once they figured things out, Demis Hassabis famously was a gamer, and that's how his whole relationship to computation was mediated, and he went on and did all kinds of other things in school. Now he has a Nobel Prize for using for using DeepMind to do things like AlphaFold and so on and so forth. Um, can you say a little bit more about gaming and the relationship it had both to the world you were in at the technology world you were in at the time in the late '90s, but also how it
Yeah, no,
unfolded?
absolutely. So as a scholar, insofar as I can be called one, I'm best known for my scholarly work on games, on computer
Right.
games. And sometimes people will ask me, like, did you always want to do that? Were you always interested in? And I played games as a kid, and I grew up when I did, and so they were a part of culture, and I did find, but I wasn't obsessed with them. I didn't ever think this is what I want to do. What I did think
Hmm.
was that games were, even as a youth, that games were one of the best expressions of creative or artistic practice by means of computers. They were like this great intersection of computation and the arts. I knew that already. So that was one piece of the puzzle. Then, as you mentioned, in the 90s, I remember very distinctively when this happened. I was working at this agency that made websites and software for other companies, which was really how the tech industry worked at the time. And we, among other things, we were responsible for the online, all the websites and stuff for Lexus, the car company.
Hmm.
So we built Lexus.com and we built a bunch of other stuff that
Not
surrounded it.
Lexus.nexus or
Right, right. Not the, you're right. But we were helping them sell luxury vehicles to rich people, to doctors or whatever.
yeah.
And, if you buy a Lexus, then maybe you're interested in other sorts of lifestyle activities like golf, let's say, golfing. And, you have these kind of affinity marketing is what we call it. And we made this golfing game for Lexus.com. And it was just a golf game. But it was, being used as advertising in that context. And I remember thinking at that moment, I was like, this is kind of interesting. This is just advertising, although advertising in itself is interesting, trying to persuade people to do things or to think ideas. That's something I have an interest in. And I thought, well, I wonder if there's more to this. If this example is the sort of tip of a bigger iceberg, using games uh, to express ideas that would try to persuade people either to do things or to adopt positions. And could that be done in a way that's different from the way that we do it with other kinds of modalities of media, with writing, or with speech, or what have you? And that was kind of the seed that planted the tree that became both the book and the game studio that I started called Persuasive Games. Like using games to express ideas that would inspire people to change their minds about things or to think about ideas differently by means of a different, what I argued eventually would a different form of rhetoric, a rhetoric of procedural rhetoric, I called it. By using software, you can depict a little model of how something works,
Hmm.
or how it should work, or how it's broken and should work better. And you can invite the player to like mess around with. That's kind of what a game is. So you just explore and you do things, you try to solve problems in a system, and that struck me as really promising, and also exactly the sort of approach that we needed to take as a society to address wicked problems, complicated, difficult, systemic challenges. And yeah, I mean, obviously, I didn't think all those thoughts at once looking at the golf game in 1996 or whatever it was, but that was the road that led me down that particular path.
So, on the one hand, many of the people you must have been rubbing shoulders with or maybe playing games with went on to develop games that were, again, spectacularly successful, but also led then to other kinds of discoveries and innovations and products and ways of coding the internet.
Yeah.
To the point, of course, where many people make links between, the kind of power of gaming, the almost addictive quality of gaming, with, of course, the way in which algorithms get used. And you were talking about marketing, and you were talking about different kinds of games. And of course, these are games that can teach you how to do how to try to figure out in a collective way, how to negotiate a built reality, but to expand it or find out what opportunities exist or whatever. But you can also use it to do what, of course, many of the social media
Yeah,
platforms
people
do,
do.
which is you just keep paying attention. You effectively manipulate algorithms to the point where attention is the single biggest commodity, which of course is what everyone now talks about when they talk about an attention economy. So, how did you see that both unspooling, but also how did you see it from the point of view of a life in which you didn't ever actually have to go to Plan B, because meanwhile you were graduating from college, you were going on to do a master's degree and then a PhD in comparative literature and philosophy?
Okay, there's a lot here. There's a lot here. Let me see if I can cover
That was
it.
my first question.
I will say that, let me try to take this in parts, and I'll start with the last bit. It was really difficult for me as a graduate student in the humanities, as a doctoral student in the humanities who was working like kind of full time almost in the tech industry, and then I had my own company. Kind of convince my mentors that not that this was a good idea. They were very supportive. Kate Hales, Emily Apter, and Ken Reinhard, others at UCLA, where I eventually did my PhD. They were very supportive. They didn't really know how to be supportive other than to be supportive. I didn't get
But
a
you
lot of
must
good
have been
advice.
a one of a kind.
I was a huge pain in the ass too, because I knew that I had other options. I hope to some extent I've overcome that tendency, but I just wasn't going to go be a French professor. I knew that, and I wanted to finish the PhD partly to be able to call myself a doctor, but not one who helps people.
So you wouldn't respond when they call for a doctor on the airplane.
Right. But I knew at the time that something was off, is what I'm saying, and that I would have to reconcile. I would get to reconcile that whatever kind of wasn't quite connecting, or whatever was short circuited between my actual interests, the way the academy worked, the way that the industry worked, and it just turned out that I've struggled with that my whole career. It still hasn't really played out in a way that's neat and tidy. But I did learn that lesson at the time, and I've continued to through my whole career. I think that's relevant as it relates to the how we got from games as this sort of promising way to deeply engage with systemic issues to, well, actually, we just have the attention economy now, and isn't that what we learned from gaming? So back when I was first conceptualizing these ideas and participating in them as a designer, this was before the social web. I mean, this was before Facebook. This was the early 2000s, before YouTube. And there was still the promise at that time, in my mind, that the future of computing would be the one that I had envisioned. That is to say, one where we were engaging with these like deep and complex sort of like software simulations of ideas that people would then not stay in the software. It would up the ante of the sophistication of their discourse and their questions outside of the software as well. And we would have a more sophisticated conversation, debate, and hopefully resolution to some of these issues. And I remember, I guess it was in the 2000, because I did a work in politics, in games and politics, and we made the first game for a U.S. presidential candidate at the studio for Howard Dean, and we were really in it at the time. And I remember telling the press at one point in 2004 that the next presidential election, 2008, every candidate would have like their own PlayStation game that had their platform kind of built into like a simulate. What is it going to be like to live in the world that I'm promising you? Here it is. You can play it. And I was totally wrong, but it wasn't inconceivable that could have happened in 2004.
You weren't wrong about the role that technology
I wasn't
played in the
wrong about
election,
technology,
but
right?
you were wrong about the precise way in
Yeah.
which it played that role.
And
Yeah.
2008 instead was the YouTube election. That was when short video became important, and of course in the 2012 election, then we got Facebook and social media, and everything changed. So I made a bet about how the world might turn out, and I tried to influence that world through my scholarship and through my creative and commercial practice. And it was just kind of wrong. It just turned out to be not the future we got. And those connections between like games of the sorts that I had in mind and games as an attentional sink, which is a problem, by the way, that we've been concerned about and tried to ask and answer questions about for decades. And like Sherry Turkle's been working on this for years and years and years. Why are games so compelling? And where we ended up instead was this sort of gamification stuff where, well, if games are so deeply compelling and addicting or whatever you want to call them, then can we like bottle that into a spice that we then apply to anything else to get you to be compelled or addicted to the service that I'm offering, which is basically what we have with the attention economy that you mentioned. So in some ways, I have no relationship. I see no relationship between the world of gaming that I envisioned and participated in that period and the one that we ended up with. But there are others who would say, it just hasn't happened yet.
Or there might be those who would say, you were, not yourself addicted to games. You always did these games in conjunction with a million other things. You had these interests in literature and philosophy. And of course, you didn't envision a future in which you would be completely captured by this one particular set of uses.
The signs were there, though. I mean, they'd always been there. The relationship between games and gaming and gambling, that was always around. And, one of the reasons that people were so worried about arcades, video arcades of the 1970s and 1980s, was partly they were seedy, but partly that sort of coin drop experience of dropping a quarter into the machine was exactly like the way the slot machine worked, And then in the 90s, we had sort of moral panics around violence in games, very, Mortal Kombat, and then we had Columbine, and there was also concerns about sort of swindling and like Pokemon, those collectible cards that came out of a video game that Nintendo had made, and that they were luring children in to sort of be obsessed. So some of the signs were in place, and moral panics. Gaming and moral panics, any kind of cultural activity and moral panics.
Any kind of technology.
Yeah, anything. There's
a moral
panic
around radio, around television.
The crossword puzzle. There was a moral panic around the crossword puzzle in the 1920s. There's always a moral panic. But sometimes the moral panic is correct. And when you play it out forward into the future.
Just because you have it all the time doesn't mean.
Yeah. So some of the concerns about games and attention and addiction and all of the rest were correct. And any gaming advocate or game developer who scoffs at it, who says, well, that can't be right, you shouldn't take them seriously. Or another way to think about it is the so-called media effects argument, the idea that playing violent video games, does that make you a violent person? And there's all sorts of research that's been done. And generally speaking, the behavioral sciences community says, well, no, but it does maybe, increase your sort of immediate tendencies or your how like activated and aggressive you feel in the moment. But how could I hold that I thought that games were going to be able to change people's minds about something? Maybe it was politics or something about the economy or the environment or something. How could I hold that position and not also admit that it might be possible that games could make someone violent? It would seem incoherent to hold those two positions in opposition to one another.
Well, but let's follow the track of your optimistic view of things, or at least your, very positive sense of the utility and possibilities of gaming. Because of course you finished your PhD, and then you went to Georgia Tech.
Yeah, I just lucked into that, really.
And you go to Georgia Tech, but you go to a technology institute that is, clearly teaching the liberal arts. That's why you were originally hired, but you end up, of course, finding an opportunity to bring together precisely those two parts of your life, your interest in
That's correct.
digital technology and gaming and so on and so forth on the one side, and your interest in education and philosophical questions on the other. So could you say a little bit about how you continued to effectively enact your vision of the world, but through an educational institution and with respect to educational objectives and goals?
So much of my life has been good timing, and this is an example. The dot-com crash had happened. It was 2001 when I was in my doctoral program. I finished my PhD in 2004, which was, and I finally stopped working in the tech industry right before that. I couldn't do both. I had to make
finish
a
the thesis.
And I was working so much. And I was just burned out, and I had a young family, and I made a lifestyle decision to pursue academia. And at that point, it seemed like, okay, I may not have to be a French professor. I'm sorry to the French professors out there. I don't mean to denigrate French professors, but I did comp lit, and that was sort of the path. You were going to go be a professor of French or German or classics or whatever it was going to be, rather than whatever it is that I am. So I just happened to luck into the moment in time in 2004 when the economy was starting to come back, but the new tech economy hadn't yet. And there was a lot of experimentation that was still taking place. And Georgia Tech, in particular, at that moment, had some degrees and some educational programs that they had started in the late 90s that were deeply rooted in the liberal arts, but also technical and about design and about making stuff with computing. It wasn't just about studying it, it was also about making it. And those both programs had been successful. Computer science at Georgia Tech had not yet become the top 5 or whatever program it is today, and became while I was there. And so there was an interest in experimentation between computer science and the liberal arts, and we ended up starting a very radical for the time degree that was administered by both colleges called computational media. That was one of the reasons they brought me in. So the picture I'm painting here is one where there was a brief moment in time between 2001 and 2005, or whenever this sort of new Web 2.0 economy really started taking off. And that was when experimentation of the kind that I did was possible. And when it was possible for me to put those universes together at a place that supported it, in part because an engineering school such as Georgia Tech didn't have traditional divisions of the humanities in particular, had traditional divisions of engineering.
Right.
But in the liberal arts, we had like kind of one big unit that had sort of all the humanities all mixed up together. And that meant that you didn't have quite as much infighting about, well, is this media studies? Is this film? Is this literature? Is it philosophy? Is it not? Where do the and the institution certainly didn't care. It didn't really think about the liberal arts as a
It
major
didn't worry
center.
about getting ranked in its
No,
departments of English
but
or
no
history or
concern about
whatever.
that.
Yeah.
And the faculty too, many of whom had been brought in decades earlier just to teach Shakespeare to engineers, and others who just, they were doing their own version of my thing, studying science fiction or what have you. So that environment at that time was just perfect for me and for my colleagues uh, to 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 build educational programs, but also to build camaraderie around our research community in doing the kinds of things that I did. And it didn't last forever, by the way. And today, not just at Georgia Tech, but almost anywhere, those conditions don't they don't really exist anymore. And so I feel very fortunate to have been able to get on the ground floor of it. But then I wonder, well, what going back and knowing what happened, what more could we have done to get ahead of the future?
Yeah.
Which, of course, is an easy question to ask in hindsight.
Yeah. Well, let me nevertheless, keep fast forwarding to the present. Not so much around reverse engineering that question, but opening up the question around many of the current discussions we're having about the role of AI in education.
Yeah.
Clearly you've been tracking AI for years and years. You know the whole history of the breakthrough with neural networks and the like. But we're beginning to hear that everything from prognostications that AI is going to make it, completely unnecessary to have the kind of educational institutions and systems and protocols we currently have, to, well, maybe it's not going to totally disrupt the institutional system, but it's surely is going to change the way we teach and learn. I have many colleagues who are worried about plagiarism, worried about not being able to teach critical thinking because nobody's going to be writing an essay anymore, using blue books in classes and so on and so forth. But I also have the same colleagues who are using Notebook and Perplexity and everything else to write their own works in the humanities and social sciences. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about where we are right now and how, and again, perhaps, continuing to wear your more optimistic hat, where the possibilities are for, bringing together the best of our educational, understandings, techniques, commitments, also the best of what AI can bring to all of our lives.
In some ways, to me, the question of AI's role in the university is really a question about change. And I remember thinking two things in the last, I don't know, I guess 5 years. After COVID, we all experienced COVID. We did a bunch of very urgent, immediate work in every university to try to make things run as well as we could and we adopted technological change for better and worse, right? But
Hmm.
we did something new because we had to. And then we went back to campus again because that's a big value for American college students and their parents, the campus life, the college experience. And we just went back to normal instantly. Like all of the, I'm not saying Zoom was good, but it was different. We surely learned something from doing it the same way that we did from these like massive online courses and the flipped classroom and that kind of thing that had taken place maybe 5 years before that.
But the massive online classes, the MOOCs and so on, didn't really last. And they certainly didn't fulfill the promise that they had to revolutionize education. I mean, when Sebastian Thrun taught artificial intelligence, had 170,000 people sign up and so on and so forth, there were people in 2011 declaring that the university was going to
Correct.
end in
They
the
were.
next 3 or 4 years.
They were. And I think about that a lot when we hear people talking about how AI is going to end the university. But what it indicated, what it represented, both the COVID moment and the MOOC moment, was how rare and scarce change is in the academy of any kind, which, of course, those of us who work in it know very well. And then when AI happened just a couple years after, and our immediate sense, the immediate question we were all asking one another inside the university was not, well, what is this thing even? What does it mean for us? Is it, what can we do with it, or what do we have to look out for? But how can we maintain the status quo? How can we make sure that change does not take place and then I can still assign the same tests and run the same papers and police the students, for example, in not using AI to take part in them? So even before we ask the question of what AI is capable of, which changes every week, to me the AI question is: Are we prepared to enact change, substantial change in the academy, for example, in education, but also in research, or not? And then a couple years after that, we get all of these changes from the Trump White House that are forcing us to ask similar kinds of questions, again, for better and worse. Can we imagine something different when it comes to federal funding or the organization of the way that that we handle student loans or whatever? All of the things, good or bad, again, that are being thrown at us. That what they fundamentally come down to is that we could not conceptualize change in the university. So I think that's the fundamental question. And then
Hmm.
when you sort of accept that, okay, let's say that change might be good, that there might be things that we can and should do differently than we have been, even though these institutions were created in part to resist change. Then what do we do with the changes that we've been given? And we've asked that question many times before with technologies, or with other forms of change, such as moving the university from something that was only for the wealthy aristocracy to something that was, at least for a while, for everyone, or it could have been for everyone.
Was for a bit.
For a bit, yeah, for like, what, 15, 20 years.
There was a golden age.
There was a golden age, yeah.
Then states began defunding our great flagship public
Correct.
universities.
And the rest was history.
And you went to UCLA. I taught at Berkeley. Both places in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s you could go to for $100 a year,
Oh, I mean,
whatever.
when I was working, when I was in grad school, I just paid fees because I was making enough money in the tech industry. I think it was $3,000 a year. I think it's now like 25. And the only reason I'm in academia is because I finished my PhD, and the only reason I finished my PhD was because the state of California subsidized it.
Yeah.
So it really makes a difference.
But this is no longer the case.
Oh, it's no longer the
So,
case. Yeah.
we're dealing with, clearly people asking questions that are in part driven by the extraordinary cost of college.
That's part of it, and that's also why we are resisting in the academy, university faculty are in part resisting adopting AI in any way, or even experimenting with it, even asking, gosh, in what ways am I at risk? How might I make use of it? How might my students be making use of it? Just so I can know kind of what's happening in their lives in order to tune and adjust what I do. So we're so far behind. How do you catch up?
Mhm.
And I keep thinking, well, maybe this is the thing. Maybe the AI crisis is the thing that will cause that plus the federal funding crisis, plus all the other crises. Will this finally force us to go back to, not to go back to the drawing board, to open the patient up at least, so we can fix some of this? We should address the ways we teach. I was talking with a recently graduated student at the University of Chicago a couple weeks ago about this topic of AI, And he was telling me about a class that he took that felt particularly AI resistant, not because it was being policed or because there were blue books or because you had to perform like an oral exam instead of writing or whatever, but because the whole design of the course was better than other courses. And so it was specific and you couldn't go ask ChatGPT questions about it because it was just like so, the problem space was so specifically designed that it just wouldn't be useful to use AI. I teach a class sometimes on programming the Atari, the 1977 Atari video game system. And in my syllabus, it's like, ChatGPT just doesn't it just doesn't know how to write code for this thing. So it's not going to work. I don't have to police you. It's just not going to be helpful. Um, and that
Yeah.
question isn't really a question about AI. It's a question about like, what should we be doing in the classroom or in the design of the educational program more broadly that deeply connects the learning experience to the outcomes, to the student experience, to the faculty, what faculty have to contribute as teacher researchers. And it's well past time to do that.
So, Ian, I completely agree with you. I've been an advocate for change for a long time, well before, both the current election and even before the release of GPT.
Right.
But,
But
many of the things that we say as our kind of default, rhetorical justifications for college are that we want to teach students how to think critically. We want to teach them how to write, how to do basic mathematics and understand some of the principles and laws of science and so on. Uh, there's a reason that moral panic now feels a little more sensible to me than perhaps some of the other examples you were giving before, because so much can be done now by AI.
Oh.
And it can be done so well, and it's done in registers that are making it very difficult to imagine a future. So, what in the few minutes we have left for this conversation, I was wondering if you can say something about how you would envision a future of change, but also and a future of accommodation to technology, but a future in which we don't just see the loss of those kinds of fundamental commitments around what a liberal arts education is, but rather in some ways an enhancement.
the it's so hard to get into school now, especially elite schools, and then to get a job out of them. And life is hard today. And we've trained young people to be min-maxers, to be strivers, to take as many shortcuts as they can, because how else can you get ahead? And now we have this shortcut machine. That's one way of thinking about AI. It's a shortcut machine. So it's going to do what it's going to do. And I think the best defense against it we have is to embrace and accept the fact that it's providing those shortcuts and to say, okay, what if we took all the shortcuts? Then what would you do with the time that you won back from them? Which is not to endorse any particular use of AI, but let's feel what it's like for just a minute to take this to its extreme. And then what is left? And then what do we turn up? What sort of knobs do we have to turn up? One example I'll give you concretely. Any kind of, and this may not work with the scaled up college experience, right? Any kind of studio like problem driven learning, whether it's in like an architecture studio or whether it's in a specific problem space that's, like in chemical engineering or what have you, you can't really AIify that, right? Because you're working sometimes in groups on specific problems, which is much more engaging to students. It's been shown, that this kind of problem based learning is much more engaging anyway. And we need to make the critical thinking stuff answer those questions too. We can't just simply say, well, we want you to teach writing, and then we're going to teach you writing kind of poorly, actually, so that you can't really write. We're going to teach you how to write research papers as if you were humanities PhDs, which isn't what almost anybody needs to know about writing. And we're not going to teach you how to do that well, even. Or what does critical thinking mean? Does it mean that you're going to take on the political position that the particular faculty member or group adopts, or does it mean that you're going to try to ask and answer questions with curiosity, which actually AI kind of does allow to some extent? So we almost need some kind of reset, and I wonder if the way to at least think through the reset is to just feel what it's like. What would it be like if we cheated as much as possible? Not because that's what I want us to do, but to then find a middle ground, to pull back from that and to design a new kind of educational experience that fills those spaces. The problem is I don't think this is likely. I mean, you mentioned optimism, and this is not an optimistic sentiment, but historically and in the present moment and under all of the kind of fiscal crises that we're now under, it is hard for me to imagine that actual change, that not lip service change, but true, meaningful structural change that produces beneficial social, cultural, conceptual, intellectual outcomes is likely in the academy. And this is a real crisis for us. And it's a crisis for me personally because I don't know what to do anymore.
Yeah.
And I don't know, do I even want to be in these organizations? These are questions that I now find myself asking, and I don't like the feeling of asking them. But that's where we're at. It's not the best answer to the question, but it's the one that I have.
No, but I mean, it's, of course, a huge question. And even if one were to, assume a relationship of optimism to the future, be like an economist, assume anything,
Right.
you would still need to take a lot of time to try to figure out how things might change in a way that would allow us really to enable both technology and current day students and faculty, for that matter, to live in a very different way.
There's this idea in computing of technical debt. Like you make something work a certain way, and you know that it's janky, but you just don't have time, and then you pay the price for that for years and years because you can't go back and fix it. It's almost like we have a kind of change debt in the university.
Yeah, no, I agree.
You know,
So we have just a couple minutes left, but I wanted to ask you about your current writing project. You're just about finished with a book.
yeah, it's
Could
a
you
book.
just tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah,
and
it's
hopefully come back and talk about it soon.
Oh, I would love to. I hope. Yeah, it's. I'm really excited about it. It kind of rolls up a lot of my interests. The book, the tentative title is called "The Small Stuff," but it's a book about gratification. My interest in games and in philosophy is largely around kind of manipulating things. Like one of the things you do with a game is you mess around with stuff, you try things out. And then in phenomenology, which is the area of philosophy that I'm most interested in, that kind of sensory experience is also a kind of first order way of being alive, being human in the world. And this book is about not happiness, not satisfaction, not like the big stuff, getting married, feeling good about your life every day, but taking enough sensory pleasure in moment to moment life that it can add up to big change.
All right. So what is the projected time
Next
for the book to come out?
summer, that's what we're looking at next summer, and it's just really interesting exercise to try to write as an academic to try to write a trade book that's about helping people in their ordinary lives, but doing so is it's been really intellectually meritorious for me, and I hope it does that.
What is the title of the book?
The working title is The Small Stuff. We'll see if that title sticks when
I
I come
see.
back and talk to you about it.
All right. Well, you can always ask ChatGPT, right?
And I have indeed asked ChatGPT for help with book titles.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great pleasure, and I do very much hope you'll be willing to join us again, both to talk about the new book, also endless numbers of writing projects. You write regularly for The Atlantic,
That's right.
so anyone interested in following the train of both thought and writing that you conduct while also doing all these other things can just take a look every week or so at The Atlantic.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And we'll look forward to seeing how your work continues to move across every possible discipline and perspective in a world in which technology is central, but happily, certainly in your work, not the only thing there is.
That's right. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. So our time has come to a close. Thank you so much, Ian, for joining us today. And this wraps up the episode of the Shaping Science podcast for the New York Academy of Sciences. To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.